Good evening. It is an honor to be with you here today in Iowa. I think this is actually my first time staying in Iowa, and it's been a great experience. I want to rush to thank Brett and thank you for that introduction. I almost forgot it was about me. I'm like, wait, I want to meet this guy. This guy seems pretty cool. That was a very kind introduction. I appreciate it. Also, Leanne, Dave, just for the invitation. I haven't been around Brett a long time, but I do not take for granted what it takes to bring someone to talk about politics and race in front of people that you trust. That's not something that I take for granted, and so I know Brett takes that seriously, and I am honored that he would entrust me with the opportunity to speak to you all today. So thank you for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation. I'll start off kind of with the lecture, but really even more excited about getting into the conversation. So before I get into my new book, Don't Let Nobody Turn You Around, I want to just give you a little background on what the AND campaign stands for, to give you a little bit of context of where we're going, okay? So the AND campaign literally means compassion and conviction. We live in a society that has kind of separated compassion and conviction, that has separated love and truth. And sadly, the church has started to reflect the society in that way. We have morality Christians on one side, and we have justice Christians on the other side. But as I read the gospel, I don't see a separation between justice and moral order. I don't see a separation between love and truth. I see the gospel bringing those things together like nothing else could. In a very profound way, the gospel brings us into a tension where we get the most out of love, the most out of truth, and we begin to see that if we have a society that doesn't have moral order, it's not going to have justice. And if it doesn't have justice, then it does not have moral order. These things go together, whereas in the world, sometimes they are presented to us as if they're in conflict. But the AND campaign is making the very clear statement that Christians, we don't tell anybody how to vote. Christians can be in whatever party they want. You can choose that. You cannot choose between love and truth. You cannot choose between compassion and conviction. And just because that tension is tough, lean to one side too far or to the other two sides too far. We need to be in that tension and to act on our neighbor's behalf from that tension. And so that's what the AND campaign is about. We're telling Christians, break out of that progressive or conservative framework for engaging society and get into a biblical framework. And the sad thing is, and the reason that we wrote our first book was, a lot of Christians didn't really even know how to talk about politics or culture outside of that culture war, right versus left dichotomy, that battle there. And we want to say, let's step out of that, because I think there's a better way to go about it, and I think I can show you proof of concept that there's a better way to do it. All right, so that's what the AND campaign is about, and we provide a lot of resources to churches and pastors to help them start to see the issues differently. Not just taking some kind of mushy middle ground, which I'll talk about that later, but actually taking the right position instead of just taking a side. All right? So my new book, I'll tell you, this is a blessing to be finished with. It was one of those books that was a lot harder than I expected to be. I got through the first one pretty well. Obviously, I had some co-authors, and they did a great job too. This one was a lot harder. It took me more time. I had to dig a little bit deeper. But I really am proud of how it came out. So don't let nobody turn you around. How the Black church's public witness leads us out of the culture war. That's the new book. Why did I write this book? There's a few reasons, and one of the reasons that I wrote this book was very personal. So once you read it, you'll see that the center of the book is around the story of my grandmother, Willie Faye from Forest, Mississippi. So I use her story along with some others to really get through this story. And she was part of the civil rights generation. So I talk about her in the center of it, and also Mahalia Jackson, who was her favorite singer. So those two are the center of the conversation, which goes out into more history and theology and social commentary from there. So my grandparents, she was married to a pastor. My grandfather was a bishop in the Church of the Living God, PGT Nation, and they really gave their lives to the church. They dedicated their lives to the church, the Black church specifically, and they were part of what I call in the book that civil rights generation. And as we know, a lot of people from the civil rights generation are passing away. And I don't want their lessons and the principles they showed us and their legacy to pass away with them. So that's one of the major reasons that I wrote this book. I think there's a lot that we can learn from them even today in our public discourse. And not to just look at it as symbolism, but something that we can actually apply in what we're doing today. Another reason that I wrote the book is I think there's a lot of revisionist history when it comes to the civil rights movement and other movements that came out of the Black church. Some have kind of painted it as a progressive movement, but I think that's false. I don't think it fits in the conservative or progressive side of things. And the other thing I would say is at the center of the civil rights movement was orthodoxy, was Christian orthodoxy. And so today there's kind of this narrative that Christian orthodoxy only comes from a very far-right, toxic evangelicalism. And I wanted to correct the record to say, no, we have some very good examples of orthodoxy, whether it's, Dorothy Day or others, but also within the Black church and its public witness. And then lastly, I think in this moment today, it seems like we've really begun to believe that things are so bad that we really don't have to employ Christian principles anymore. Like, those are cute for when everything's, when the issues are small, but when everything really gets serious and we really get scared and desperate, we can't use those principles anymore. And I think this particular movement shows and gives us proof of concept that actually this is exactly when we have to lean on Christian principles. This is exactly when we have to trust that doing things the right way and even treating our enemies better is actually the best thing to do, right? Because we can lose sight of that when we get kind of in a sense of desperation. So that's why I wrote the book. And the other thing I want to point out, because I know some people are even uncomfortable with the idea of kind of talking about a Black church, but I would say it's very similar to talking about the Dutch Reformed Church, right? Nobody cringes when you say that. It's just the church is the church. It's an aspect, a part of the church, and I'm being very specific about that part of the church. But I think any accomplishment that comes out of the church, the Black church, is an accomplishment in general for Christianity, and people can see the true biblical principles inside of this. So I want to be very clear, although I am highlighting the accomplishments of the Black church and that social action tradition, it's not an exaltation. There's also a critique. There's also a critique between what the Black church was at that moment and what it's doing now, right? So it's a critique of everybody. It's certainly not an exaltation or to pretend and romanticize as if this was just the perfect church and everyone needs to be exactly like that. I do think it has something to say about this moment, okay? So the book starts off in Reconstruction, right? So basically with the passage of the 14th and the 15th Amendment, it opened the doors for Black men to vote and to also run for office, all right? And so this is where the book begins in about 1865, at the end of the Civil War, until probably 1877. That's the Reconstruction era when America was trying to rebuild itself after the Civil War. And so you have Union troops and all that in the South trying to make sure that it rebuilds in the right way. And then sadly, they actually withdraw. And we'll talk about what happens then. So at the height of Reconstruction, there were about 2,000 African-American males that held elected office. This is right after slavery. 2,000 African-American males, and many of them were Christian preachers. Because a lot of times in the African-American community, they were the most educated, the most articulate, and they were just seen as the leaders. So a lot of them were actually coming straight out of the church. So you're talking about Robert H. Kane, Hiram Revels, Henry McNeil Turner, Tunis Campbell, George Freeman, and then you had a lot of just Christian laymen like Robert Smalls and others, okay? Again, we have this period, which is fairly short, maybe not even 15 years, where you have straight out of slavery. We're talking about people who had been in the fields, really just doing that type of work, and then they get an opportunity to actually run for office and be a part of building this country up. We don't often talk about that period. It's almost like a forgotten period, but that happened, and there were 2,000 around the country, mostly obviously in the South. And then a deal is basically made, Union troops withdraw, and then the South is left to its own devices again. And so this is when you see black codes. Later on, you're going to see Jim Crow, and it pulls all that political power from this group that just got it. And so you literally had people who were in office that as soon as the Union withdraws are pulled out of office. There's all these massacres that happen, and all that political capital goes away in a flash. One of the greatest injustices this country has seen after slavery. But again, this is about a public witness. So I want to talk about what is the Christian public witness. When we talk about public witness, what are we talking about? We're talking about a testimony to society about what we believe is good and true and what is false, immoral, and unjust. Your public witness should tell people those things very clearly. It tells people what we value, what we represent, and who we serve. All right? Our public witness, and here's the big thing, our public witness doesn't belong to a political party. It doesn't belong to an ideological tribe. And here's the number one thing, and I want us to think about it this way. A Christian's public witness does not even belong to them. It belongs to God. Now, how differently might we think about how we talk to our political opponents, what we post on social media, if we were really thinking about the fact that our public witness belongs to God, right? If we go to 2 Corinthians 5:20, it says, we are ambassadors of Christ as though God were making his appeal through us. Can we really say that with every way that we address people we disagree with, or how we describe them and talk about them? Does it really feel like God is making his appeal through us and how we communicate as a church? It's something to think about. Now, our public witness can be used constructively, and I'm about to show you in many ways how it was used constructively, or it can be used destructively. But it's more than just verbalizing our convictions. It's more than just saying, I think this is good, I think this is bad. It's the application of those convictions in social action. It's our priorities and what we consistently do. And the harmony or disharmony between what we say and what we do is what other people see, and it either credits or discredits who we are in the faith. And I think a lot of us can say, regardless of what side you're looking on, there are a lot of Christians who have a lot of disharmony between what they profess and what they actually do in the public square. But as Christians, we should always have that in mind, because as Christians, while political wins are important, our witness is more important. We have to choose the witness over the win in conflict. So an example of a beautiful public witness, we don't have to go too far, but go to Exodus. And if you recall, when the midwives undermined the king's edict, remember the king wanted to kill all the Hebrew boys, but these midwives, their public witness proved that they valued those boys' lives and the image of God more than they feared human authority, right? We understand you have authority in this world, but you're not the ultimate authority. And so they go against it and say, we're going to show you what we value by risking our lives to save these boys and to speak into the importance of human dignity. Let me move a little quicker now. So I want to say there's three primary things I would point out about the Black church's public witness that kind of distinguish it from other public witnesses and really distinguish it from what a lot of Christians of all races are doing today. Number one, and I'll go through these in more depth, but I want to list them out for you, is they connected the spiritual to the socio-political. Who they were and what they learned in church, they did their best to bring into the public square, not to be two different people and have some sort of duality within that. Number two, they upheld social justice and moral order. They did not fit into the culture war, conservative versus progressive binary, right? That you couldn't describe this tradition in that way. Number three, they acknowledged the potential of wickedness in themselves and not just in their opponents. We're all very good about talking about how the other side gets things wrong. I think I can show you some examples of how they actually had to acknowledge how they could get things wrong as well in order to be faithful. And then lastly, they chose moral imagination over contempt and cynicism. Moral imagination over contempt and cynicism. So this was a group of people who talked about morality in heaven, but unlike parts of the white evangelical church, they didn't limit God's will in the public square to just personal piety. So we can talk about heaven, we can talk about the importance of righteousness, but we can also talk about what we should be doing in the here and now and how we should be treating our neighbor and how that should reflect who we are. They recognized that social justice was a required part of the kingdom plan, but unlike secularists, they clearly didn't interpret the separation of church and state to be a severing of one's faith from their social political engagement, right? Faith guided and anchored their social action, all right? To go on, here's another comparison. Unlike the social gospel of today's progressive Christians, they believed that the whole counsel of God was more than just the justice imperative alone. That you could not just talk about justice alone and not talk about holiness and other things. I think another big distinction is that it also involved the Bible's tenets about sin and how sin exists in all of humanity and not excluding their own community. And then lastly, I think there's a challenge for even black secular activism here. While it was understood that power concedes nothing without demand, they believed that their social action still had to be aspirational, holy, redemptive, and that no group, not even their oppressors, were irredeemable. All right, so those are the four, I gave you the four areas of distinction for this particular tradition. So I want to talk about, so we're talking about how this tradition can lead us out of the culture war, and so I want to make sure that we understand this culture war situation. American sociologist James Davison Hunter defined the culture war as a struggle between progressives and conservatives over the national identity, over the meaning of America. It's a battle for power and cultural dominance, and it manifests in political and social hostility rooted in different systems of moral understanding, right? So this is the moral majority versus the sexual revolution, things like that, right? Now, I want to be very clear. One of the main arguments here is where truth comes from and where is authority derived, right? So the conservative worldview would say that authority is derived from above us, right? It comes to us from God. A more progressive view would say that authority actually comes from, a secular progressive view would say the authority comes from the individual, right? So the individual is actually the authority and the source of truth. This is at the heart of the debate when it comes to the culture war. Now, I want to be very clear. A lot of the issues in the culture war are very important. My argument is not that these issues shouldn't be debated and talked about and that we don't need to have a discourse about them or advocate for them. It's about how we do it, right? Are we going to do it through tribalism? Are we going to have a zero-sum approach? Are we going to depend on this type of polarization, this opposition-centered politics? And I even go into in the book, I even go into something like morality by comparison. How we look at things is really based on what others do. So as long as I can point to something, if I do something wrong, it's only bad if I can't find something on the other side that's worse. If I can find something on the other side that's worse, then what I did isn't really that bad in comparison. But as Christians, we should know that just digs a deeper and deeper hole that is really never ending, right? Our morality isn't based on what the other side is doing. It's based on the tenets that we received from God. So that's some of the issues that we have with the culture war, but it's that this battle, and my biggest issue with the culture war is not that it shouldn't be fought, but it actually keeps us from addressing issues because we get so caught up in winning this culture war that we're not addressing what the people next door really need from us, and we're not even getting to those debates because we're caught up in these rivalries and these things that we just can't seem to get past. So let's talk about the first distinction from this tradition, which is connecting the spiritual with the socio-political. One of the first ways that you'll see this is in spirituals and gospel hymns, right? The Black church tradition always took the church and what they sang in church and took it directly into the public square, right? So if they, for instance, there's tons of songs. Let's say, talk about Keep Your Eyes on the Prize. That was actually a song they sang in the fields, which was Keep Your Hand on the Plow. And so when they went to the streets, they just changed the wording, but it was the same song. And so singing these songs brought the church with them into everywhere that they went, and it brought the principles within these songs to them. Keep your eyes on the prize is basically saying, regardless of what you're going through, remember what the ultimate goal is. Remember who will ultimately has the victory. And so if I'm singing this, keep your eyes on the prize, and there's dogs and there's all type of violence around me, it allows me to have the strength and the courage to go through it, but also to maintain a positive spirit, right? So they try to make sure that they weren't just going out and being one thing in the church and something totally different when they got outside of the church. Another song that's interesting to me is, I'm going to treat everybody right until I die. And these songs were often very repetitive, but they were repetitive for a reason. They drove home the point. I'm going to treat everybody right until I die. How simple, but yet profound. When you think about, they weren't just talking about people who blessed them. They were talking about people who lynched them and bombed their churches. I'm still going to treat them right until I die. Because they deserve it? No. Outside of human dignity, because God told me to. Right? And songs like this were a penetrating exposition about how those who are committed to seeing the human dignity in everyone can somehow find the image of God even in the most hostile manifestations of human brokenness. It speaks to how the only way to see God in someone who hates you is to see what's invisible outside of faith. You have to want to see it. And sometimes you have to be willing to imagine it in spite of all other indications. And so we see that these spirituals served as disciplines, as a way of forming one's perspective and reiterating their standards in the middle of the toughest and most dangerous situations. How can we get back to bringing our faith with us in the toughest situations, into social situations where we don't think we can be nice and we don't think we can do the right thing? Again, number 2 is upholding social justice and moral order. We have a false dichotomy in our society right now, again, where we separate love and truth, we separate justice and moral order. In this tradition, you didn't see that. In fact, historian Mary Beth S. Matthew said that the Black church deliberately refused to entirely side with the left or right in the culture war. She said that the terms liberal and conservative are too binary to be of any assistance in trying to understand the Black church's theological or political positions. There is a different way to see our politics and our culture outside of the culture war. And if you want to see that, you just need to look no further than this particular tradition. I would add to this, think about Jesus. When Jesus comes onto the scene, there were already groups vying for supremacy or prominence in his culture, right? He could have came in and he could said, you know what? Those Pharisees are really legalistic. I'm just going to be a Sadducee, right? Or he could say those Sadducees really lack belief. I'll just be a Pharisee. He never did that because it wasn't about him choosing a side. It was about him bringing something very different and revolutionary to the conversation. And I truly believe that right now, it's a fair argument to say that neither side has the answer and that both sides have had their opportunity to fix everything in the ways that they promised that they would. Maybe it's time for Christians to realize there's actually a different approach, that just like most objects in the world don't just have two sides, a lot of the solutions that we need, there's more than two sides of how to get it done. All right? So it's not about choosing a side, it's about choosing the right position. And I take a lot of time within this book to give a very thorough critique of progressivism and conservatism. Very thorough critique. One of my main critiques of conservatism is, if we look throughout history, we have to admit conservatism got slavery and Jim Crow wrong. I think that should bring us a little bit of humility when it comes to how we look at others. Now, we can defend it, we can pretend like it didn't happen, but I think there's an issue where sometimes conservatism can't really deal with the past, doesn't really reckon with the past, because it can't admit those failures. Now, you come to progressivism. One of my primary criticisms of progressivism is that progressivism doesn't always want to deal with the facts of life. If I think that truth comes from the individual, well, when the individual's truth runs up against biological facts, historical facts, then I have to push away from some of the facts of life. And another one of the big ones that I think, one of the big problems that progressivism has is it struggles to deal with sin. Because if truth doesn't come from above us, if truth is something we don't control, then I have to deal with sin. But when I make myself the authority or my culture the authority, how can anything be sin if that's what I want, right? And so I think that's a problem that progressivism really deals with, is it can't really deal with sin and a creator or an authority outside of itself, all right? And obviously I go deeper into both of those critiques in the book. Number 3 was acknowledging the potential wickedness in themselves. If you read Christian writers from this tradition, you don't see what we see today, which is completely demonizing everybody on the other side and not going to God and saying, but I'm also a sinner and I need your help too, right? And one way that we can see this, even if we go to Luke 18, verses 9 through 14, we remember the praying Pharisee, right? The praying Pharisee stands there and there's a publican, a tax collector right next to him, and he's like, thank God I'm not this guy, right? Thank God I'm not like him. The tax collector, on the other hand, is like, I'm not even worthy to be here, God. Have mercy on me. And which one walks away justified? The tax collector. How often do we do that to the other side? How often do we think, thank God I'm not a progressive, thank God I'm not conservative, because they get everything wrong? No, you're a sinner and you need God just as much as they do, right? We kind of pretend that everything would be better if our side had all the power. Do we really believe that? We act like we want absolute power for our side, but the truth is, none of us are fit to steward it. And when our side has had the power, we've shown that. And so I think we need to be a little more humble in how we address others. It doesn't mean that others can't be wrong and that when they are wrong, they need to get called out. I think there are some ideas and some movements that deserve a very democratic and public death, right? There's some ideas that are just bad and they need to be pointed out. This is not relativism, but for us to look at ourselves like we're perfect, for us to look at the world as purely good on our side and purely evil on the other side, just allows us to get away with a lot of evil and allows us to ignore the good that other people may be bringing to the conversation. All right? This is something, even if you look at the principles of the civil rights movement, this is something that they always talked about. Make sure you purify yourself. Make sure that you're righteous. Make sure that you don't react in this way, because it's not just them that are sinful. If they hate you, guess what? Their hatred can be infectious and it can affect you too. You have to watch out for that. And I think one of the greatest lessons from the civil rights movement was, yes, they wanted to change systems. Yes, they wanted to change policy, but there was something that was even more important than that, which was that you could never allow your opponent to have a negative impact on your spirit. Because you could win the court decisions, you could win the political races and change the policy. If they had a negative impact on your spirit and change your spirit, you had lost too much. Is that really the way we think of things? How often do we let somebody who we think is wrong on something change our spirit and how we address them? If we really, I really think this is probably the most important one. If we really captured that I have to acknowledge the sin in me and the need for transformation and a savior for me, it gives us a little bit of humility when we address people, even who we disagree with. And I think that's really a huge thing that's missing in the culture war, because the culture war, so much of it is about pride and not admitting when we're wrong and pretending like the other side is the cause of everything that's bad and evil in the world. And sometimes they are wrong, but I think we need to look at it a little bit differently. Lastly, again, is the moral imagination. Moral imagination. Historian Andrew Manis said that African American spirituality looks at disappointment and despair and death. It looks it in the face and declares that beyond all these things, there is hope. Think about that in this moment, to look at disappointment, despair, and death and say, because I believe in God, there's still hope. How many people do we know today that seem hopeless? Well, I'm showing you a group of people who probably went through more than most of us are going through today that still had hope and that challenged one another to maintain hope. All right? And this is moral imagination. I think part of this comes from Romans 24:25. Faith is hoping and believing in what you do not yet have based on God's promises. Moral imagination, as I define it, is the hope that we employ as we interpret our experiences, set our expectations, and order our passions. It determines our disposition. Moral imagination is the ability to see not simply what has been historically, or what is in the present moment, or what's likely to be in the future. It's the ability to see what ought to be. And the Bible gives us enough to know what ought to be. Can we see it in very tough moments? Right? Can we live by faith and not by sight? These are the questions that we have to ask when we are in the toughest moments. What does it say to the rest of the world when we're just as fearful and just as desperate as everybody else? It says we don't really believe what the Bible says. We don't really believe what we profess and what we say our convictions are. If we have no sobriety in moments that are dangerous, that are tense, that are polarized, what message are we sending to other people? And if you simply, you can go on YouTube, if you simply look at some of the marches where there's dogs and fire hoses coming at people, and then you look at their posture, you look how they react or don't react, that's a testimony. That's a public witness of who we are as Christians. When your life is on the line and you still have the ability to react in a godly way, in a God-glorifying way. What if Christians were doing that? What if Christians on both sides were doing that right now? We're refusing to be hopeless, helpless, nasty, vengeful. What if that was our witness right now? How different would this conversation be? Because there's a critical mass of Christians on both sides of the aisle, and if we both were committed to these 4 things, I think we have a much different conversation. So thank you. I want to open this up for questions. If anybody has a question, Mike's here. I can also bring the mic to you. Raise your hand.
I really appreciate what you saying. on yourself that are really taking hold of this message and proclaiming this message. I'm probably too isolated in the work that I do, and anyway, but I just am curious if there are certain theologians or people who are influential that are agreeing with this message and proclaiming this message.
Yeah, I think you see this kind of message, and I can give some smaller names, but they're worth looking up. So I think Alan Noble has been here before. So Alan Noble is somebody that I look to, who's a friend of mine that I look to think he's really kind of upholding this. I'll be honest with you, it's very hard to find it in national politics because it's so partisan and polarized.
Right.
So it's very hard to point to one person that's kind of doing that. But I have plenty of theologians and people in local politics. I think Charlie Dates is another person who does a really good job within these conversations. Lisa Fields, and there's some practitioners as well. But those are certainly people worth looking up to be helpful.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
How did the black churches, in the face of such opposition and difficult circumstances, develop this more biblical and godly approach, and how can it be imported to churches that need it?
Mm-hmm. How did they develop it?
Yeah.
Well, I think if you look at it historically, I think it starts to develop during slavery. Mm-hmm. And it literally was a matter of survival. So there are even atheist historians that say the faith of enslaved people was how they survived that situation, right? So it was a survival mechanism, but it was just really believing what the Bible said. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what you see in the black church is looking at the Exodus deliverance narrative, mm-hmm. seeing themselves in the Hebrew slaves and believing that there was something better to come. There really, outside of faith, there really wasn't a whole lot of reason. That's why I talk about moral imagination so much. There really was not a whole lot of reason to believe things could get better other than that God said it would get better. There wasn't a whole lot to hold on to. You didn't see anybody that looked like you in power. Anytime that you tried to maintain power, it was beaten out of you. Anytime you raised up a leader, they were assassinated. The only thing you had was the trust in what God said. And that shows you when you're low. I mean, this is in part why why the Bible talks so much about the lowly and the meek, because in those situations, your faith is sometimes all you have. And I think that's the key. I think they were in a situation where that's all that they had. And I think that builds and goes into abolition, obviously the Reconstruction era, Jim Crow. And I want this to be a legacy for the whole church. And so what I end with in the book is that I'm telling you this about the black church, but this is really the legacy of the church in general, and it's something the church as a whole should grab onto. That's the context by which the AND campaign exists. We come out of the black church tradition, but we also mix that with G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and Tim Keller, right? Like, so it's all these coming together that makes the church have a beautiful public witness that could really be useful right now, but we have to call upon those things in the moments where it's the hardest to believe that they're actually effective.
Hi, I just want to say, first of all, thank you. I've been following the AND movement since before Compassion and Conviction was fully released.
Oh, wow.
So
Thank you.
I've been very fascinated by the kind of work you do to bridge the partisan politics that face our nation. A question for you as a law student, and I know there's a few other law students in this setting, what advice would you have in terms of navigating kind of legal careers, and what would you look for in terms of finding spaces that align with your values if you were back as a law student?
That's a really good question. And I think, number one, prayer is the most important thing. I don't think there's a space where it really depends on what you're passionate about, because I don't think there's a space in law that, hey, Christian, don't ever touch that. Don't go near that. I think we need Christians in prosecutorial roles, defense roles, corporate roles. We need them all there. And so I think it's really about what am I passionate about, and then finding ways to impart what you believe. I mean, there's just a lack of trust in institutions right now. And if you look at a lot of institutions, attorneys are always somewhere in the middle of those institutions, and sometimes part of the reason why there's not a whole lot of trust. But what does it mean to have people that are trustworthy? Because I truly believe to have a functional society, you've got to trust your institutions. But I can't tell you to trust an institution that hasn't been trustworthy, right? So it's like you have to meet the people halfway. And so we need people like you to follow their passion into spaces where it's corporate spaces, criminal law spaces, to show people what integrity really looks like, to take those small stances, even day by day, to say doing this right is more important than just winning. Caring about the people who nobody else really cares about because they don't have the money to get the best attorney really matters. And so maybe your heart is there. It's in the defense of those who would ordinarily not have a strong defense. Just pray about that. Find where your passion is. But we need attorneys in all different spaces with integrity.
Well, first, thank you for being here. I thought your first book was great. My only complaint is the guy I lent it to never gave it back to me. Let's say that tonight...
You have an attorney here, so maybe that could be her first case.
Let's say tonight President Trump reads your book and he adopts the End Campaign platform, and so does everybody else. What happens? What is a Christian response in a world where one side is right or more right than the other side? What does that look like?
I think it looks like addressing people differently. So I think we've gone from saying, you're wrong, let me show you why, to saying, you're wrong, you're irredeemable, and you have nothing to contribute. So if I think you're wrong, I'm still going to say you're wrong, because people are getting hurt if you're wrong. But do I have to demean you? Do I have to humiliate you? Do I have to talk about you in a way that makes you look like you're not worthy to be in this conversation at all? I don't have to do that. And the fact is, that's not really more effective. I truly believe, we live in a constitutional republic. We've come to a place where we think it's more authentic and more passionate. If you really are passionate about an issue, then you'll curse, you'll call people out of their name, you'll talk about them in a certain way, because that shows that I'm really serious about it. I don't know if you've seen this, but politicians now, everybody's cussing, and for some reason that seems more authentic. But I would say that actually is a disservice to the issue that you're advocating for. Because ultimately, in this type of government, this type of system, you have to persuade people. Do I persuade more people by calling people names, or do I persuade more people by making the better case? And nobody can tell me that making the case with a temper tantrum, a public temper tantrum, is better than doing it in a composed way. If Frederick Douglass could go and debate about slavery after being a slave, think about that. I can go debate slavery after being a slave and keep my composure. Then we can keep our composure in the public square. And I truly believe that. And I think one of the greatest things that Martin Luther King accomplished is that he didn't hold any punches. Some people think when I'm saying this, I'm saying hold punches, don't say what needs. No, say what needs to be said, but take the time to be artful about it and say it in a way that people can hear and accept. That's harder. That's harder than the temper tantrum. But it's more effective and it's more faithful, which is most important.
I'm not entirely sure quite how to say this. In terms of within a worship service, it seems to me that it's been much easier to call out sexual sin and issues around gender, etc., than it is to call out issues around justice and righteousness, in terms of righteousness meaning right relationships and the way we treat each other. Mm-hmm. That often seems to me then people that say you're politicizing, whereas if on the other side you can say, well, this is sin and you can't do it. But I think if we look at Scripture, there's much more about justice and righteousness than we have about sexual sin. Now, obviously, they're both wrong. But I wonder just in terms of how to deal with that, and so that it's not politicized, and it's in the vein that you're asking, you're encouraging us to engage, but to actually get more of the critique of injustice and lies and that kind of behavior.
Yeah. So I think you hit it on the head. That's sort of a manipulative rhetorical device. When people say you're politicizing, you're being too political or politicizing, it means you took a stance that I don't agree with, right? Like that's a lot of times what people are saying. And so what I think Christians have to understand is it's impossible to say that God is the ultimate authority and not be somewhat political. This is why tyrants always have a problem with Christianity throughout history. I'm saying you're not the ultimate authority. I'm saying, pursuant to Romans 13, I will obey you up into a certain extent, and when you go outside of that jurisdiction, I will not obey you anymore. For somebody that's trying to have absolute power, that's a problem. And so the Bible in general can't help but be somewhat political. What we can watch out for is being partisan, right? The Bible is not it's not something that's neutral, but the Bible is something that's impartial. And so I think for leaders and people talking, you want to be impartial, but to get to your the part about sexual sin versus social injustice, and it depends on your tradition, right? I've been in churches where they only talk about the other too much, but that's what we get at. You have to talk about both. You have to show people, and I put it this way one time, a lot of people dislike Marxism, and I think Marxism has a lot of issues. But I also think if you were living in the South as an African American family, was Marxism really worse than Jim Crow? Right? Like, so how, we like to demonize certain things, but not look at the things that are closest to us that are wrong. And so I think when we can't justify the actions of those in our congregation, and we know we'll get pushback, well, we'll focus on one sin. We'll focus on one, sexual sin, and we can beat up on that because these people may not have a voice. But I don't really want to touch the sin of greed and, many of these other sins that are happening around me, racial injustice, because that's not so easy to talk about without getting people mad. And so I think we have to preach, just like Paul says, and I think Acts 20, we have to preach the whole counsel of God. We can't leave out one side. We can't just talk about sexual sin every day and condemn and beat up on one group and not talk about greed and injustice in society. But it goes the other way too, because there's churches that just talk about justice and it becomes social gospel and all that, but they don't want to touch the things that matter for your salvation too. Like both of these are matter of being transformed and really obeying God. And so we have to preach the whole counsel of God. And guess what? When you preach the whole counsel of God, somebody's going to get upset. I mean, that's the price of discipleship. Somebody's not going to be happy, but that's what we're called to do.
My question is about money in politics. So last year I received 100 texts from Kamala Harris asking me for money. I received 100 texts from Donald Trump asking me for money.
Yeah.
Both of them promised me that if they won, I would have more money. Mm-hmm. That seems so contrary to what the gospel teaches us in terms of priorities. Yeah. And I guess I'm just curious what you think the church's response should be, at least in my perspective, to a national political world that's hyper-focused on both giving money to politicians and then also accumulating personal wealth. That's
very important. You don't have to go too far. In the Gospels to hear Jesus talking about the least of these, talking about how we need to share, how we need to take care of other people. If our politics, so one of the things that I talk about is the politics of Christian self-interest, where Christians go into the public square and we do things that are good for us. We do things that further our convictions, but aren't really worried about our neighbor. We do things that are about in our financial interest, but we don't consider others. If within how we analyze politics and how we come to political conclusions, the poor and the less fortunate aren't somewhere at the top of our priority, that's a problem. Now, we can disagree economically and what's the best way to help people. But as Christians, I don't know how we have a public witness or make decisions and votes without some consideration of people who are less fortunate. There's room within the framework to disagree on how to do that, but we should all, in a good faith way, be trying to help those that are less fortunate. And I think that has to be somewhere on our priority list. If not, that's a problem. It's idolatry. I mean, we can't serve two masters, right? We can't serve mammon, and that's what we end up doing when we're so focused on that. Now, does that mean that we can't use money as a tool to get certain things done? No, I don't think we just, throw all our money in the ocean. And no, there are ways to use that as a tool to do right, but we can't worship. It can't lead us, right? We can't be led just by our financial interest, even though we don't have to ignore them. We should have a priority for those who have less and how we're going to, and our willingness to help them out.
As a dad, how do you teach this idea of compassion and conviction and public witness to your kids? Like, how do you take this message and disciple it to the next generation?
That's really good. And I do try to teach this to my sons. So one thing that I tell my sons, again, you have to cover both. Okay, how do I give them convictions and make sure they have compassion? So one thing that I often tell my sons is, the world is going to tell you to live for yourself. The world is going to tell you, do you live your truth, do whatever you want to do. Jesus said, live the way I told you to live. And I tell them over and over, we all have battles to fight. We all have internal things that we want to do. Fight your battles. That's the conviction, right? The conviction is, I don't just do what I want to do. I have to care about others. And I give them examples, right? They may have friends who, they found out, they come to me with a story about how, their dad left, they haven't seen him and things like that. And I say, well, why does that happen sometimes? Because he did what he wanted to do instead of what he was supposed to do, right? And so just to give them an understanding of, no, you hurt people when you live only your way. That's the conviction. And then the compassion is, who's the kid in your class who nobody really talks to? You need to go talk to him. Why? How would you feel if that was your brother? You have to care about people who others don't care about. You have to defend people who others don't defend. And I think that's one of the early lessons I learned from my grandparents is, you don't just defend yourself. You don't just come to your own rescue. You defend other people because it's the right thing to do, and they might not have the wherewithal or the ability to do it for themselves. So it's just lessons like that, and I'm always looking for proof of concept. I'm always looking for a positive example of somebody who was self-sacrificial and say, oh, see, they did what God told them was going to do, what God told them to do, not what they wanted to do. And so I think proof of concept for kids, and you all know this as well as I do, proof of concept is so important because parents kind of become white noise after a while. They need to see people doing it and living it out, and I think that's always helpful. So that's how I tried. How successful I've been, time will tell, but that's what I've tried to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your gracious and confident message. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You answered this a little bit already, but I was interested to know, are there specific practices, either individual or communally spiritual practices or otherwise, that you would encourage in people who are trying to live into this moral imagination and among others? I mean, you talked about your kids. I really liked how you also brought in the example from the Black church of bringing the songs from slavery. Are there concrete ideas for right now in our present circumstances?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think one of them is collectively praying for your opponents, your political opponents. And I'm not just talking about imprecatory prayers, right? I'm talking about praying for them, praying for them to have good judgment and, things of that nature. I mean, it's hard to hate somebody if you earnestly pray for them on a regular basis. And I've had to say, the way I'm looking at this person, the way every time I see them on television, makes me, let me pray for this person. And it changes your posture in that regard. So I think that's one very serious, and that's a daily thing. Anybody, think of the person that you dislike the most right now. If you pray for them every night, it doesn't mean that you're going to say, oh, I wake up in the morning, now I think they're right. No. That's not the point. But you do look at them differently and hope for redemption rather than kind of a vengeance. Other thing I would say is one practice that we have, and we had about 10 disciplines that we went around the country with last year, and one of them was being able to identify the errors on your side. So all of us can list 101 errors on the other side and how they get everything wrong. And one of the things we usually say about the other side is they're not very thoughtful. They're really just indoctrinated and go along with whatever their leaders say. That's what we say. Well, prove to me that you're not the same way by listing 10 things that your side gets wrong. And if you can't list 10 things that your side gets wrong, then maybe you're kind of in the same situation as they are, right? And I think it throws people off because a lot of people can't necessarily do that. Another one on the opposite side is trying to find the virtue on the other side. You can think the other side is wrong on most things, but you should also be able to find something that they actually get right. So for instance, let's say I'm a progressive, I should be able to look at conservatives and say, you know what, I do appreciate that we have somebody in society that cares about the sanctity of life. Even if I disagree with their end conclusion, what would our society be like if nobody cared about the sanctity of life and what it meant to have human dignity, right? I should be able to look at conservatives and say, you know what? The way they've created cultures that adopt other people's kids, I can disagree with them on who they voted for or whatever and say, that's good. That's a good practice within their culture. If I'm a conservative and I look at the left, and I know this isn't popular, but I should be able to say, I'm glad somebody cares about inclusivity. Some of the church's worst moments in America were when we did not include people. I'm glad there's people that dedicate their lives to making sure that other people are seen. Most people, even if they get a lot of stuff wrong, even if they're generally wrong, most people's lives aren't just about being malicious. There's some good that they think they're attaining or that they're aiming to attain. And I don't think that you can have a constructive conversation with someone unless you can articulate the good that they're trying to achieve. And most people cannot do that. Articulate the good that they're trying to achieve and make sure that when you disagree with the other side, you're disagreeing with their best arguments, not their characters. Their best. So that means sometimes you got to seek and find it, right? That means you can't just watch Fox News or MSNBC. They're not going to present you with the best argument on the other side. And so you need to go seek that out. Because what they're going to do is they're going to feed you red meat to get you more upset and get you to keep coming back. And that's why I tell people, turn off the cable news. It's not really about news. It's about getting you to come back. It's about feeding you narratives and keeping you in a state of rage. And let me tell you this, any leader or any influencer that always needs to keep you enraged, you got to watch out for that. Because when you're enraged, you're not thoughtful. When you're enraged, you're easily manipulated. Never trust a leader or an influencer that's always keeping you enraged. Even when there's a lot of bad stuff going on, a true leader is going to find a way to make sure you're still aspirational, to make sure that you're still hopeful, to make sure that you're still positive. Stop listening to people that aren't doing that, because that's an agenda that has nothing to do with Christ. And too many people are caught up in that rabbit hole.
So we see in Scripture that the church is called to care for the poor, the widow, the children. It seems to me that the church has handed that off to our government. And by more and more programs, we're going to take care of all the social justice stuff. When I see in Scripture that we, the church, are called to care for those things. What are your thoughts?
I think you're absolutely right. I think whether it's education or a lot of other issues, we have pushed that off. Now, I want to be fair. I want to say that there are a lot of communities that didn't really have a choice. Like for some churches and some communities, but for the government stepping in, they never had a chance, never really had the resources to take care of all those things. Best case scenario, yes, the church steps up and the church takes on more of that burden, because the church is always just going to be, government by design is cumbersome. It's not good at responding to change. There's a whole bunch of issues that come up with government. That should be a last resort. And knowing the resources that Christians have, knowing if we work together, there should be no churches that don't have more resources to engage more when it comes to education, when it comes to childcare. Because we don't share in that way, there are a lot of churches in certain areas that just don't have the ability to do that. So I want to say you're right, but I also want to say, practically speaking, that's very hard depending on your social location.
First of all, thank you for being here, and I want to say thank you for the commentary you had on the compassion and conviction answer that you gave about your children.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a big brother to a young man who's an African American and has never met his dad and never will. And that's a hard thing. Not up here to speak about that at the moment. But I am wondering what your thoughts are on the loss or the brokenness in community in our country. In his outgoing farewell speech, Dr. Murthy, our outgoing Surgeon General, wrote a prescription for America. And he said the number one thing that needs to be addressed is the need for community and interaction. We get so hooked up thinking we're in relationship with interaction through social media, but we don't do what you and I are doing right now, and that's kind of looking one another in the eye and being in the same room together. And he talked about the need for purpose, service, and relationship. I'd like you to just speak to those three things momentarily, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, Christian community and community in general is food for the spirit. We have lost our understanding of need, because number one, there's a few reasons we become very individualistic, right? And so we just go off and do what we want to do in the moment and just kind of lose sense of all community until we need it again, and then we're like, where's it at? I think that's one part of it. And you hit it on the head, technology, social media. We think we can connect to people in the same way without being in the same room, hearing their voice, getting a hug, no really intimately getting to know what they're going through, and it just doesn't work like that. And so I do think it's so interesting to me too. I'll back up a little bit. I have so many friends, some of my friends who are not Christians. I hear their complaints and see what they're going through, and I just say, that's what the church is for. Like, if you're lonely, we have a loneliness crisis. Nobody within 20 miles of a church should be lonely, right? Like, and the church has to do a better job. And I think this goes to what the lady here was saying. The church has to do a better job. Yeah, we can talk about what it means to be holy and what God says, but are we showing people that we love you? This is a place where you can come not to be condemned, but to be loved. And if people knew that, if people knew they could come to a church and it could help them through loneliness, help them with dealing with a lot of the issues they're dealing with just spiritually, I think we see a different, I think our society would be a lot different, but we do have to get a better understanding what community is for. And I think we need leaders that articulate that better. This is why community is important. This is why, yeah, you're still an individual and you can do certain things, but here's why you need community. I'll give you an example. I think people just have become consumers and they expect other people to build community. So even in so I coach Little League football, and I can't tell you how many people just go around from team to team, and I'm like, you're a consumer of the team. You're leaving the team because it's not perfect, but what obligation do you have to build, right, to make it better? It's just like people who go to church from church to church. Well, what obligation do you have to make the church better, not just say, oh, this didn't fit me perfectly, and as a consumer, I'm going on to the next thing. No, you're part of the building this and making it better too, and it's not just about your comfort, right? So there's things that we need to get a better understanding of or view of, but it's going to take time. One perhaps positive of some of the things that's going on in society is I think a lot of the promises that spoke against community, that spoke against the church, are failing people. And they're finally starting to see, wait, this doesn't work. And you see it, unfortunately, in a lot of the mental health crisis and all those things. The things that when people told you do whatever you want to do, it'll make you happy, and as long as people accept it, it's not working. And I think people are starting to see that, which presents the church with an opportunity to open its arms and show people who we really are.
Thank you, Justin, for coming tonight. My question is, I've heard a lot of pastors say that the pulpit and politics don't mix, and that there is no room to preach about politics in the church space. And then I've also heard some other very public pastoral figures say the exact opposite, that when we see inherently anti-Christian policies being proposed, it is in fact the mandate of the pastorate to preach against those things. So what do you feel is the role of the church, and in particular church leadership, in adding dissenting voices against policies that may be inherently anti-Christian?
Yeah, I just think it's hard to maintain that we can't touch on serious social issues or political issues and read through Jeremiah and read through Isaiah and read through Amos. I don't. It's hard for me to understand how you can make that case in view of those books, and even Jesus. Like, it's just hard. That's a hard case to make. But what I think people are saying, and so I want to be charitable, what I think some people are saying when they say that is the church should not be partisan. But being partisan is very different than addressing an issue that may have a political aspect. Politics touches every aspect of society, from what we eat, to what constitutes a crime, to what children learn in school. How in the world, if we go to church, right? I mean, we saw that if we're allowed to go to church. How in the world can the church be completely separate from that? Be separate from that and still love its neighbor. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But what I would say is, no, I don't. I think pastors have to be very careful of being partisan in the pulpit, of being partial in the pulpit, right? So what I would say is, when you can, at least focus on the principles that apply to certain social issues. You don't have to tell people exactly who they need to vote for and all that, but you should talk about the principles that apply to that particular issue. All right, and let the people kind of take it from there. But you do have to speak into those things. If there's, if our church has all kind of resources and there's a vote at the city hall that could really impact our neighbors, and we know it's clearly wrong, to say, hey, we need to weigh in on this issue, I think makes sense. And it doesn't have to be partisan. But I understand, too, that there's some churches that have taken it too far, that are just completely political and that are being driven more so by ideology than actually sound theology. That should be addressed, too. It's just hard to read the whole Bible and say that the church can't touch on anything political. Well, everything's political in some way. And as we heard here, when people say that, a lot of times what they're saying is, I don't want you to talk about certain issues. Because there's a lot of people say don't talk about social justice, but go ahead and talk about abortion. Well, they're both political issues, right? And just be cautious. And I think for pastors too, we can't expect pastors to know everything, right? And so if you're not sure about an issue, you don't need to go and because sometimes what I see is pastors going up and just repeating talking points from like MSNBC or Fox News. That's not a good idea. I think sometimes you have to pull other people in that you trust to have the conversation, but we have to understand as people in the pew that pastors aren't going to know everything about every single issue, and we shouldn't have that expectation.
Justin, thanks so much for being here. I have a question about political parties. So as Christians, do you think it's helpful to be identified as, I'm a Christian Democrat, I'm a Christian Republican, or is there merit to being independent, being not attached to a specific platform or party? How would you suggest we think through that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would first start to answer that by saying, first understand that your party is not part of your identity. I think too many Christians, when they say I'm a Republican or a Democrat, that's actually part of their identity and who they are. I think that's wrong. A party is a tool. It's a tool you use to do good within society, right? So yeah, I think Christians can choose a party because, I think this party gets more right or that party gets more right. That party cannot become the master of your social action, though. You cannot outsource your public witness to a party. You have to have a kind of prophetic distance from your party, even if you're within a party. That being said, we also can be shrewd, right? And so I may be in a party because that's the best way to get things done. It doesn't mean that I do whatever the party says. I agree with whatever the party tells me. But I may say, you know what? Most of the people in my area are Democrats. I'll be a Democrat. It's not part of my identity, but I'll be that, and I'll push back against the things that I think go against my convictions. I'll be a Republican, that's fine. I'll push back against the things that go against my conviction. You cannot be a faithful Christian and go along with everything your party says. That's indoctrination. That's one of the things that I have often said is to be conservative or progressive on every single issue all the time is intellectually lazy. Because there's no way that one side, and we can see it throughout history, is right about everything. And so are we really, if we're on one side on every single issue, are we really thinking through those issues? Because I can show you a number of issues where both sides got it wrong. And so if we're just concerned about choosing a side instead of the right position, then we're in trouble. So yeah, you can be in a party. Sometimes it may be better to be independent. Our system makes that tough because it's harder to run for office. You got to get all these signatures, and it just makes it really tough to do that. It's not impossible, but it makes it tough. So if a Christian finds it to be better to enter a party to do it, that's fine. Just understand that party is not your master. And that's where the problem occurs. Very few Christians take that stance once they get the taste of that power. They don't want to give it up, and they kind of go along with whatever their party says.
Hi, Justin. Thanks for being here. I have a question. It sounds like as Christians, we can legitimately be Democrat, Republican, but are there certain issues that we're dealing with today, or you see on the horizon that whether Republican or Democrat, we should be united in saying that this is sort of a red line as believers, we need to address this or that issue or this or that legislation?
That's a good question. There's a few issues I think Christians can be in different parties but should all agree on. I think issues like education and literacy. Christians should be able to come together and say, no, we need to get through this literacy crisis because we can disagree on DEI and all that other stuff. It doesn't matter if the kids can't read, right? I think parental rights is one, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, every Christian should care about parental rights. Every Christian should care about the sanctity of life. I don't think that you can be a faithful Christian and a Democrat and not say you're going too far on abortion. Even if you don't agree with all the Republican conclusions, I think that's problematic. I don't know that you can be a faithful Christian and not push back against some of the rhetoric that's used against immigrants and other. I don't think you can be a Christian Republican and not push and faithful and not push back against some of the rhetoric that's used against other image bearers, right? So you can be in the party, but you can't just go along with everything. And I think those are a few of the issues that we should all be able to agree on, even if we have disagreements. Again, there's different ways to get at certain solutions, and that's why what we give is a framework, not to say everybody has to go about it this way. Economic theory, there's a lot of different economic theories, but we should still care about the poor, right?
Just for something practical, then how can we encourage our politicians, especially those that maybe we didn't vote for, to be people of integrity, to do what's right? We've been trying to track some of the people that we didn't vote for, but if they've said or done something right, write them that letter, and instead of trying to persuade them to do something different that we know they won't.
Yeah. I would keep in mind that politics isn't really an individual endeavor, right? We have to be effective, you need to join with other people. And so I think the first thing that Christians could do to have an impact on both sides is to create nonpartisan coalitions that can speak to both. And that's in part what the AND campaign is trying to do. There's a critical mass of biblical Christians on both sides of the aisle. Can you imagine if we said, hey, here are 4 things that we're all going to agree on, and we're going to push this to both sides? The church is like a sleeping giant in that regard. But we can't seem to get past the stuff we disagree on to say, here's what we agree on, and let's work on that. That would, to me, I think and that can be done on a local level, right? It may take longer on national level. On a local level, I don't think Christians understand the power they would have if they chose a few issues. And one of those issues is maybe how our politicians talk, and are they acting with integrity regardless on what side you're on. We should all be able to agree on that. But we would have so much power if we would be able, influence, I should say, is maybe a better way to say it, if we would come together beyond partisan issues. And I think we do have to realize one of the reasons it hasn't happened is that we both have allies. On both sides of the aisle, we have allies that don't necessarily want us to come together because they would lose a lot of power if we actually talked instead of using them as the go-betweens. We would actually see that we have a lot more in common than we might think.
This is, I guess, maybe more of a comment, but it seems to me that really at the fundamental level that our big problem is that we don't take the whole of Scripture into account, that we, we cut out the parts that we don't like, or there's, many Christians who know nothing about the Hebrew Scriptures, and then how Jesus really fulfilled them and re-emphasized the points, or other things, but that if we really took the whole of Scripture into our lives as our life, and our rule of life, that we would have maybe, I don't know if easier time, but we could at least, recognize our own problems, where we're falling short, and then be more gracious to others.
Yeah, I think you can look at each of the American church's biggest missteps and see that it was picking and choosing Scripture. We should all know that we interpret Scripture through Scripture, right? You don't isolate Scripture and just work on that. If we took the whole thing, some of the arguments that we make wouldn't even make sense if we took the whole Scripture. And honestly, the AND campaign, compassion and conviction, is built on that premise, right? That you can't just look at the part of Scripture that serves your interest. You got to look at the whole thing. And that may bring you into a tension, but that's the only way to be faithful.
All right. Any more questions for Justin? I think we could probably take one more. All right. I think they've all been answered. Well, Justin, thank you so much. It is just an incredible encouragement to hear this evening. I think one of the things that just struck me was, you said this earlier, that witness is greater than winning. And not to create a bumper sticker, but in that it just seems like witness is winning. And the opportunity that we have, obviously, as the people of God, to see that platform of the witness to be an influence for His kingdom is an incredible privilege and honor. So thank you so much to Justin. Let's give him a round of applause. Justin's plane doesn't leave until 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, so he's got plenty of time to hang out, take pictures, sign books. Again, encourage you to pick up Compassion and Conviction. It is a phenomenal read. I can't recommend it highly enough. And today only, it's 30% off, okay? So get yourself a copy. And again, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to Parkview as well. Go in peace.